If you're ever in Iowa and you have even a slight interest in Norwegian immigration to America, you should visit the Vesterheim Norwegian-American Museum.
There is very little arable land in Norway, and land became one of the big push factors for immigration.
The museum almost reads like a highlights reel of Norwegian-American immigration. Inside, you'll find budnader and rosemaling, but also a ship gallery. At the center of it stands Tradewind, a 25-foot wooden sailboat that carried two Norwegian brothers from Norway to North America in 1933. At the time, it was the smallest sailboat ever to cross the Atlantic. Outside the main museum, a brick outline marks the Restoration, the first ship to bring Norwegian immigrants across the ocean to America. A few years back, I visited the museum with my friend Kirk Mies.
It is really exciting for us to have this idea of a ship that brings the story out of a corner of the ship gallery where a lot of people passed by it in years past, but to bring it out here where everyone can read about the story and get a feel for the size of the ship and really appreciate the unique nature of the sloopers as an immigrant group that traveled together, stuck together, moved west together, and kept their identity up until the present day.
But what makes Vesterheim especially interesting is that it doesn't focus only on the people who made history in record-breaking ways. The museum also makes space for ordinary people and everyday life.
The story starts in Norway, and this Valdres house is a small landowner's home.
There's a heritage park with 12 historical buildings arranged like an open-air village. One of those buildings is the Ulrik Koren house. More than a century ago, a woman named Elisabeth Koren lived there. She was a pastor's wife who came to the United States as a young woman and grew old on the prairie. And what makes her extraordinary is that she captured ordinary life in writing.
Vilhelm took me on deck for a time to watch the stormy sea. It is interesting when it is so angry how it broods and breaks, and what a pretty color the wave crests have as they rush on. It is fascinating to be up forward and to see the ship plunge its prow into the water and watch the waves boil and foam about while the ship momentarily lies on its side so that it seems to touch the surface of the water. It seems impossible that the mountainous waves will not crash upon and flood the whole deck. Seldom indeed is the sea higher than today. I think I have never been out in such wind before. I could scarcely draw my breath, and my face became salty from the sea spray.
This excerpt comes from the third chapter of Koren's book and was read by one of Elisabeth Koren's descendants, John Nelson. Nelson is from Decorah, Iowa, but he now lives in Texas. He is, of course, far too young to have met Elisabeth Koren in person, but he did meet someone who knew her.
You know, I just remember meeting their youngest daughter. Yuvi and Elizabeth's youngest daughter was still alive when I was a child.
Wow.
But she was at that point in a nursing home. But I just remember all the glowing things that people would say about her. So even though I didn't know her in the prime of her life, she lived into her mid-90s, I think, and was the organist at his church, in the church he founded 50, 60 years, something like that. So
Nelson first read the diary many years ago. What stayed with him was Elisabeth Koren's keen eye for everyday life and the quality of her writing.
she didn't seem to be super religious. I mean, she was part of the church, obviously, but I don't think that was her principal calling. I think her principal calling was probably supporting her family and a very observant person, obviously, with enjoy that, as a writer. I think she looked at writing as kind of a calling as well, something that that she was good at. And fortunately, the work was saved. I think her children originally published her diary in Norwegian, probably shortly after her death or so. So it's been there for quite a while.
Do you think she had like literary ambitions?
I don't know what, I'm not sure how many female authors there were in those days, to be honest with you, or what the market was for Dano-Norwegian texts and all that. But she definitely, I think, saw writing as if not a vocation, as definitely an avocation. I also read someplace where she was quite hard of hearing, didn't have a very good hearing. So I don't know if that makes her more in her world of writing more, if that helped motivate her to write even more. I'm not sure. I get, just the journey over is probably the most interesting for me. Just kind of the timeline of that, and their first year in the Midwest, where they were promised a parsonage to live in, but that wasn't done yet. And you could see obviously this was an area where the settlers had just come in and probably just trying to establish their farms. So they lived kind of from cabin to cabin for a number of months before, I think they finally got into a parsonage about the time their first child was born, I think. And just so that whole experience, and of course, then I think you've seen the cabin and in Decorah, it's still in existence at Vesterheim, and to imagine living in that with another family of 6, I think on the other half of it, it's pretty. It makes a good story.
But before the frontier, there was the ocean, as Nelson alluded to earlier. And before the ocean, there was the life that Elisabeth Koren left behind. At first glance, there was little reason for her to leave Norway at all. Born Else Elisabeth Hyssing, she came from a wealthy and well-connected family. Unlike many Norwegians who crossed the Atlantic in the 19th century, she was not driven by a lack of opportunity. Her family was firmly rooted in the bourgeoisie in Norway. Her father was a prominent politician, and her grandmother was the writer Christiane Koren, known to many as Mor Koren. So why leave? The answer was marriage. In 1853, Elisabeth married her third cousin, Ulrik Vilhelm Koren. Shortly after, the newlyweds set out for Iowa, where Ulrik had been called to serve as a pastor for Norwegian immigrants. The move was not meant to be permanent. The plan was to spend a few years in America before returning home. But first, of course, they had to get there. The opening section of the memoir follows the 11-week journey across the Atlantic. The couple traveled first class to England before boarding a ship bound for New York. What makes these pages so compelling is Elisabeth's attention to ordinary details. Again and again, she pauses to record the small moments that made up daily life at sea. She notices how Sundays, all of a sudden, feel like any other day when there are no church bells or services to mark the week. She writes about French warships passing in the distance, sunsets over the Atlantic, a Norwegian woman giving English lessons to fellow passengers, and the Swiss traveler who yodels. And of course, there is the ocean itself. For weeks, it stretches endlessly in every direction, until finally the passengers catch their first glimpse of America. Elisabeth's observations can be surprisingly candid. Staten Island strikes her as beautiful. Long Island, well, not so much. What fascinates her even more, though, is American society. Coming from Norway, she is used to a fairly class-rigid society. People typically remove their hats for members of the clergy. On the voyage itself, the separation between first and third class passengers was also impossible to miss. In America, though, many of those distinctions seem to fade. In New York, everyone rides in the same railway car. Elisabeth finds that both exciting and compelling. At the same time, she is struck by the speed of everything around her. And New York is only the beginning. The journey west continues by train for as long as the tracks will carry them. After that, the travelers transfer to horse-drawn wagons and press onward into the interior. One of the most vivid scenes in the memoir comes during a river crossing on the frozen frontier.
We drove down to the ferry and found the river, as we feared, full of drift ice and saw no possibility of getting across with horses. The ice was solid for some distance, so the luggage had to be pulled out upon it before it could be moved into the canoe, which was to take us across later. I was very much frightened at going right out to the edge of the ice, which we had to do in order to get into the canoe. Here we seated ourselves in the bottom, holding on firmly with one hand on each side and our hearts in our mouths. We really had to sit still in that little light canoe if we did not wish to see ourselves overturned. The ferrymen stood, one in each end, and made their way between the ice cakes with their paddles. They were Frenchmen and showed their lively disposition by shouting and yelling like wild creatures, encouraging us not to be frightened. That was not necessary. Nevertheless, I was glad to reach the shore.
The river was just one of many barriers she would cross. Even when she finally reached her destination, things were not quite as she had imagined. A house was supposed to be waiting for them. Instead, she and her husband spent their first year sharing a log cabin with another family. That cabin still exists today. It is the Koren cabin, now preserved at Vesterheim in Decorah. What I find interesting is that Koren does not spend much time complaining about any of this. She simply records events as they unfold. She writes about the first Christmas in Iowa, with grape wine and Fattigmann pastries. She writes about the smell of fried pork and coffee. She recounts conversations with other Norwegian immigrants who are surprised to discover that America does indeed get cold in the winter. She also listens in on discussions between her husband and lay preachers and religious dissenters. She records all these small details of her daily life that otherwise would have been forgotten. Even when she writes about dreams of Norway and the big house that she left behind, her tone remains remarkably calm and descriptive. Was this because she and her husband felt such a strong sense of religious calling? That's possible. But whatever the reason was, there is something striking about the way she documents the challenges around her. The hardships are there, but so are the routines, the conversations, and the moments of curiosity. And through observations, we get something else as well. We get a window into what it was like to be a pastor's wife on the prairie.
The same loneliness, Wednesday, July 12th. Naturally, I did not write either yesterday or the day before, for Wilhelm is home, and then the diary always fares badly. He did not get here for dinner as I had faintly hoped he would. Late Monday afternoon, I was on the lookout and was just thinking of taking my knitting and going for a walk when a woman came to ask advice for her husband, who had an inflammation of the eye. So for one day, the medicine books took the place of the walk. They were consulted a good deal while Wilhelm was away. While I stood mixing a blister plaster for her, Carolyn ran up and said the pastor was coming. There he was, too, outside the fence, letting down the rails, strong and healthy looking, though tired from driving all day. But God he be praised, he had no ill effects of the trip, strenuous it must have been, having preached as he had done every other day, and then the journey itself, and on top of that being wringing wet with sweat several times a day.
This was, of course, John, but he is not the only living descendant of Elisabeth Koren. Just a short walk from Vesterheim Heritage Park, there is a bookstore called Dragonfly Books. Inside it, you'll find a woman named Kate. She is familiar with Elisabeth Koren in more ways than one.
My grandmother, Esther Torreson Nelson, was adopted as a young child by Elisabeth Koren's daughter and her husband. So my grandmother grew up with Elisabeth and U.V. Koren being her grandparents. So they're my great-great-grandparents. My grandfather, David Nelson, is the one who translated the diary and published it along with help from his sister and my grandmother's cousin. And so I grew up with that around the house, but I probably did not read it until I was in college, which would have been when I was about 18 or 19. And I read all of it then, and then I've gone back and read parts of it later.
The first time Kate read Koren's diary, she found parts of it a little bit boring. And perhaps that's because, much of the time, not very much happened in Koren's life. Koren was, after all, a pastor's wife living on the prairie. Her days were filled with household chores, visitors, church matters, and the routines of everyday life. But that is also what makes the diary so valuable. We ought not to forget that most people don't live super eventful lives, and ordinary lives matter too. And Koren reminds us of something we often forget. Life could be boring in the past as well. People back then also worried about practical matters. They were gossiping, just like us. They entertained guests. They drank coffee. They waited for things to happen. Kate told me that one of Elisabeth Koren's great contributions was that she preserved a part of women's history that might otherwise have been lost.
You know, you need to hear the women in their own voices say what it's like to be a woman, to be in a new country. What is it like to run a household, keep a family fed?
Throughout this podcast, I returned again and again to Elisabeth Koren's gift for capturing the Norwegian immigrant experience. But that is, of course, only partly true. Most Norwegian women on the prairie were not pastors' wives. They did not come from prominent families, and many of them did not have the time, education, or opportunity to sit down and write lengthy diaries and letters. In that sense, Elisabeth Koren was unusual.
But the fact that her experience of immigrating is so different than many of the immigrant stories that we hear, where when she travels by boat on the ship, she's not in steerage. I mean, she's traveling with the captain, having meals with the captain, conversing in German and Norwegian with the passengers. and realizing how different that is than others, other immigrants who leave. And she's not leaving because of needing, she and UV didn't leave because there wasn't a space for them in Norway. They left because they were called to come to a different country, as UV being a pastor. So being that pastor's wife and coming. The other things that strike me is how much time she had to write. She would go out for a walk when, for example, when the floors were being cleaned. It was a very different life than I'm used to. When I was that age, I had to vacuum the floors and sweep the floors and didn't get to go out for a walk while that was being done. But also there was a sense of loneliness that comes through when she's up writing upstairs, and when she's waiting for UV to come back from being on the circuit and just being away from family and friends.
As you briefly touched on, she has more of a upper middle class background than what was common at the time. To what extent do you think that is reflected in the story? Do you think we kind of get a little bit of a sanitized version of how it was to immigrate at a time, or do you think we just get like a different story, or do you think that we actually get something fairly representative to how it was to emigrate at the time?
I think it's a different story. I think leaving home, not knowing where you're coming from, reading the letters or the stories that have been shared in Norway of why to come to the US, why to come to America. I think that story is going to be universal across immigrants. But I think her personal story of both the travel, but also coming and knowing that you don't have to build your own house. You're going to be living with somebody. The congregation is going to be taking care of you and building you a home. It's that part of it is different. And I think the friendships that she ends up having with other pastors' wives, again, is indicative of her kind of the more middle upper class status that she has. But the experiences of being in America, away from family, getting to know new people, getting to know new relationships, that I think is going to be true of any of it. That's the true immigrant story too.
Koren's diary was first published while she was still alive, but by then she was no longer the young woman that once crossed the Atlantic. She had become a mature woman, a mother, and a grandmother. Since then, the book has been reprinted several times and read by generations of readers in both Norway and the American Midwest. But why does it still matter? I will let Koren's descendants answer that question.
The Koren story has been shared through many Luther College students reading the diary as a part of their coursework, or reading parts of it. So UV Koren was also, he was called to be a pastor in Northeast Iowa. And he started, or was the first pastor in many, many different churches in the area. So there's probably, or having that impact on the communities as being their pastor is huge.
It shows that it wasn't just a romantic adventure across the prairie in a schooner or something like that. I mean, it was a very hard hard life, and they came as a calling. I think the people they were serving probably came out of financial or economic opportunity, and started as farmers and brought the church with them, which established the institutions, which then led to, I think, a lot of the institutions in the Midwest. A lot of the colleges came from the church, and that became kind of the backbone of the communities, the local church and educational institutions. So it gives a good background of how that really started, that it wasn't quite as easy perhaps as automatic as maybe people thought it would be.
My name is Frederick Halstveit, and this podcast was made in conjunction with Vesterheim and with the support of Norway House Foundation in San Francisco. The music you hear in the background was made by Jan Skoglund.